If you are familiar with the Christian calendar, sometimes in the last couple of weeks, I've mentioned various dates like Pentecost, Ascension Sunday, Pentecost. Well, if you're following the Christian calendar, today is the second Sunday after Pentecost, and the Christian year moves into what is called ordinary time. This is actually a very long season. This lasts until the beginning of Advent, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas Day. Ordinary time. So much of every life is spent doing ordinary things. And these months of ordinary time are an invitation to follow God through the everyday landscapes of our lives. Following in the midst of the ordinary awakens ourselves to the extraordinary things around us. We can notice the unusual, the unbelievable, the wonder of daily life. And, Christmas and Easter, we get a lot of hype days like those. But the truth of the matter is that God is the God of ordinary time. And so, in this summer of ordinary time, as I introduced last Sunday, I want to ponder some of the seemingly quite ordinary things of God's creation that preach to us. The plan is to ponder the ordinary things of creation that we often overlook or we don't think too much about. And so last Sunday we began by talking about dust and how these things, these ordinary things, these things of God, what do they exemplify? What do they tell us about God? What can we learn from them? And so hopefully we'll get a deeper understanding of the world that we live in and the God who made it all, as well as of His Word. The color of ordinary time, there are colors associated with a lot of this stuff in liturgy. The color of ordinary time is green, which maybe is appropriate for this time of the year that we're in. But I think it would be correct to say that the most popular color of the world that God has created is not green. It is actually blue. And so people talk about the blue planet that we live on. And maybe we don't think of that too often until we see a picture like this, until we realize that 70% of the surface of the earth is covered by oceans. And when you look at our planet from outer space, it looks blue. The oceans contain about 1.35 billion cubic kilometers of water. If you're still on the imperial system, that's 324 million cubic miles. And as I mentioned, that's not only 70% covering 70% of the Earth's surface, but that is actually 97% of all the water on Earth is found in the oceans. Fascinating. In the 1970s, a retired Oxford University professor by the name of Alister Hardy founded the Religious Experience Research Unit in England. And he made a national appeal for data. He asked people to respond anonymously to this question. Have you ever had a spiritual or religious experience or felt a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday life? And he received some 6,000 anonymous responses, personal accounts. And 81 of those were experiences associated with the sea. A number of those referred to events aboard a ship or a boat in times of danger. Several accounts were from sailors who had experiences during the Second World War. And the respondents describe sensing the close presence of God and a feeling of peace and security that overcame the fear and the circumstances in which they found themselves. The other common experience described was very different, but no less powerful. And these were accounts of people how For example, when they're walking alone along a deserted beach or a coastline and they looked out to the sea, they had this overwhelming sense of the existence of a creator and of being united with the rest of creation. Now, I understand, living here in the middle of Saskatchewan, that we're maybe not as familiar, not as acquainted with the seas, with the oceans, although for myself, growing up on the West Coast and others, West Coast, East Coast, the oceans are very much a part of life. And for many nations in the ancient world, the seas were a place of confusion. The seas were places of darkness. Because think of it, as you look out onto an ocean, you have hundreds of thousands of kilometers of miles of blank, featureless depths filled with storms, filled with enemies coming from overseas to rape and pillage your land, filled with sea monsters. And so in all kinds of biblical passages, you read how the people of Israel, like other ancient peoples, had this fear of the oceans. Israelites who sailed into the Mediterranean, and they didn't call it the Mediterranean then, they simply called it the Great Sea. They frequently got lost, frequently were shipwrecked, many drowned. Some returned with stories of mysterious giants in the deep, and others got swallowed by a huge fish for 3 days, or simply disappeared. And even today, with our advanced technology, with our huge ships, with our search and rescue systems, with our satellite navigation systems, the open ocean still has that capacity to frighten. It is still unpredictable and scary. And so just a sampling of some headlines that I was able to come up with just in the past a year. So you can hardly blame, when you see headlines like this, even from our day, you can hardly blame the ancient Israelites for fearing the sea, because the sea can be scary. But Israel's view of the sea wasn't just practical. It was, if I can say, it was theological as well. The waters were viewed as this agent of judgment, and the seas, the oceans, the waters were something from which God's people needed to be rescued. And so you have this passage, and this is a passage that I'm sure many of you are familiar with from the opening chapters, the opening verses of the opening chapter of the Bible. Tells us that in the beginning, this earth was formless, empty, or formless and void, depending upon your translation. It was shrouded in darkness, and it was covered with water. And the creation account in the opening verses of the Bible relate how God gathers the waters that are covering the entire face of the earth into seas. And he forms the firmament to enclose the atmosphere and to hold back the sea from above. I've already mentioned how the sea is important, how the sea provides all the water on the earth. You, at some point in your science and in school, learned about the water cycle, right? The evaporation cycle, whatever you want to call it. Water springs forth from below. And in Genesis chapters 7 and 8 describes how water drops through the openings in the firmament above as rain or snow, and provides water, and even provided the water for the great flood. And so when God judges humanity in Genesis, he effectively reverses the process from the beginning. In the beginning, God separates the waters, makes dry land appear, but when He judges, and I'm talking about the account of Noah and the ark, as we're familiar with it. He reverses that process from the beginning, and he floods the world, and he washes away the evil with it. The first attempt to eliminate the Hebrews by the Egyptians, do you remember what that was? Was drowning their male children in the waters of the Nile. And when Israel eventually escapes from slavery in Egypt, through the Red Sea, right? God holds the waters back, and the Pharaoh's chariots are buried in the sea behind them. Jonah's fishy experience, which I've already alluded to, wasn't a nautical accident. That was a result of God's judgment upon this prophet who was running away from the mission that God wanted him to undertake. And so the sea in the Old Testament is not just a bunch of H2O. It is spiritually significant as well as being physically dangerous. But Yahweh, the Lord, is king of the sea. And so although the oceans can be frightening, Israel knew that the God that they worshiped was the God who had created the seas. Yahweh was the God who made a boundary line for them that they could never cross, according to the psalmist. And in Job, we read, God said to the seas, "This far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves stop." The tide cannot advance beyond the line set by its creator. And the psalmist in another psalm talks about, and we're familiar with this, maybe with these words, how God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. And so we need not even fear when the oceans roar and foam and swallow the mountains. Look at this passage in Isaiah and another psalm. Isaiah says the sea is thunderous, powerful, but it pales in comparison with the one who measures the waters in the hollow of his hand. Mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. And so the fact that Yahweh was king of the seas, God's authority over the sea, gave great confidence to Israel, actually, in times of need. Even though Israel, as a land-loving people, had this fear, had this trepidation with the seas, still they knew that at times of need, God's authority over the sea gave them confidence. And so, how is Noah rescued? He's rescued through the waters of the flood. Moses is rescued from the waters of the Nile. Israel itself, as I've just mentioned, it was rescued through the Red Sea, from the Red Sea. And because of this track record of marine rescue, if I can call it that, when Israel is facing exile, when Israel is facing judgment, it calls out, the people through the prophet Isaiah call out to God, and they say, "God of the seas, save us again." So the appeal goes out as they face exile and judgment. Awake, awake, arm of the Lord. Clothe yourself with strength. Awake, as in days gone by, as in generations of old. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced that monster through? Was it not you who dried up the waters of the great deep, who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over? In other words, wake up, God. Save us from the waters of judgment like you've done before. And this appeal from Isaiah provides a whole new meaning to Jesus' calming of the storm in Mark chapter 4. You may be familiar with this account. Luke actually, if you read in the Gospel of Luke, Luke calls the Sea of Galilee Lake Gennesaret. Fair enough, it is a lake. It contains fresh water. It's actually less than 10 miles across. Some of you have been there. Okay. Matthew, Mark, and John call it the Sea of Galilee. I think the reason they do that, because they're saying, among other things, that it's a place of danger. It's a place of confusion. And so in this account in Mark chapter 4, a storm strikes and the boat is if you've ever been on a boat in a storm, I don't need to describe. The boat is lurching up and down. Waves are crashing over the side. They're at risk of sinking. And Jesus, meanwhile, is asleep. And so they wake Jesus up and they cry for help. And in their cry for help come the echoes of Isaiah 51. Wake up, God, save us from the waters of judgment like you did before. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And Jesus stands up and he rebukes the wind and the waves. He says, quiet, be still. And instantly, the water becomes calm. The howling of the wind and the howling of the disciples is silenced. But notice the line that follows. The disciples ask, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Who is this? I think these words are they're an expression of amazement, yes, but I think they're more than just expressing amazement that they've just witnessed a powerful miracle. Because if you read the first 3 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, you realize that by this point, actually, the disciples have already seen a number of miracles. This isn't the first time. And you could depending on how you want to put it, you could even suggest that the miracles that they've already seen are even maybe greater than this, because there has been a man that they have seen cleansed and healed of leprosy. They have seen a paralyzed man get up, take his mat, and walk home. But with the calming of the storm, there's the realization that there is only one ruler of the sea. There's only one who has the authority to say, quiet, be still. This much and no more. There is only one who can wake up to part the waters and still the waves. The disciples had left that evening on an 8-mile or so crossing with a very tired and sleepy teacher. And a few hours later, they find themselves in the middle of Isaiah 51 with the creator of the world, the God of the Exodus, the king of the sea. Who is this? Who is this? Notice something else. While the storm is raging, understandably, they are afraid. But when the storm stops and they realize who Jesus is, do you see it? They're terrified. Everything's calm now. They're terrified. The sea was frightening, but the king of the sea is terrifying. In a strange twist here, the disciples are more fearful at the end of the story than they are at the beginning. But their fear is now in the one who is for them rather than against them. Maybe the fear of God is like that. Maybe the fear of God is like that. I think of the scene in which Aslan is scarier than the White Witch, if you're familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia. Dumbledore is more alarming than Voldemort. Or there's that scene, I think it's the final scene in Jurassic Park. You're more afraid of the T-Rex who's coming to rescue the children than the other dinosaurs that are trying to kill them. There's the Lion King when Simba and Nala are rescued from the elephant graveyard. They're more afraid of Mufasa, who's actually on their side, than they are afraid of the hyenas who aren't. Maybe that's kind of like fear of God. But the disciples are terrified, fearful, scared in a good way. It's a good way. Because they know that Jesus is on their side. So it's not a trembling terror. It's not that they're shaking in their boots. I think their terror is appreciative. It's reverent awe. Who is this? And that's the only appropriate response to the ruler of the sea. Interestingly, from that point onward, something shifts in the story of Scripture and the sea. 2 chapters later, the disciples are in nautical trouble again, and Jesus walks toward them on the water. And he says, in this case, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid," before once again silencing the wind and the waves. This could actually be translated, "Take heart, I am." If you know the I am statements from the Old Testament, when Moses encounters God in the burning bush, he says, "Who are you?" God says, "I am." And I'm sure the disciples in these words, "Take courage, take heart, I am. Don't be afraid." And then, in the book of Acts, we find the story of Jonah reversed, right? We have another Jewish preacher, and he heads west into the Mediterranean, but he is going to reach the Gentiles rather than try to avoid them by taking off a different direction. And the sea is not something that judges, not a thing of terror, but it is a means of transport, not a means of judgment. And so Paul sails all over the place, as this map of his journeys tries to communicate. And you do know that Paul ends up shipwrecked. This is in Acts 27. And this is, let's see if I can do this. This is on the island of Malta here. Ship lost in storm. And the story ends in Acts 27, though, with the entire crew being spared, and the entire island of Malta is healed. The sea is still powerful, but one more powerful now rules, and the chaotic ocean is now subdued. And so in Acts, this becomes the means of the spreading of the gospel to the world. And here we are today, not just one ocean, but two oceans away, talking and sharing and singing praises to Jesus. In 1 Peter, the preacher who called for those present on the day of Pentecost to repent and be baptized in Acts chapter 2, he writes about how water, which saved Noah and his family, the waters of the flood, now symbolizes baptism that saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So water is not destructive. Water is now something to be terrified of. Water is no longer symbolic of judgment, but of salvation. And finally, when the new creation is described in the book of Revelation, have you noticed there is water everywhere? Sorry, landlubbers, but there's water everywhere. And it's a fresh, crystal-like, life-giving water that actually is described as flowing from the throne of God. But the deep, primal source of darkness, the sea, the source of monsters, fear and confusion, that is now abolished. It's been abolished by the king of the sea. And so John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. Genesis 1, the earth is covered in water. God separates the waters. Revelation 21, there's no longer any sea. Earlier in Revelation, you go back to chapter 13 of Revelation, the sea is the source of this seemingly satanically empowered beast. Quite a frightful scene. And so that has led some to understand that this idea of there no longer being any sea in the new heaven and the new earth means that the source of evil in the world is gone. That's certainly true. Others say that maybe the fact that there's no longer any sea in the new heaven and the new earth, because seas separate peoples. And now there's no longer any sea. All the nations of the world are together in front of the throne. Fascinating. The seas, the ocean, the things of God. The ocean has intrinsic value to God. It wasn't created just for our benefit. And you see that in many places in the Bible. Going back to the passage in Genesis 1 where God creates the seas, it just doesn't create an empty body of water, right? He lets the waters teem with living creatures, and he sees that this is good, and he makes sure that this is all good prior to bringing humans onto the scene, so to speak, right? And going back to the psalm, I referenced Psalm 104, and a little bit further down in Psalm 104, the psalmist expresses God's creative power, and he even talks how God has a playful side. I know we don't think of God as having a playful side, but read Psalm 104, verses 24 and 26, because it talks about how God formed the great sea creature, Leviathan, to frolic in the ocean. I don't know what Leviathan is. You can research that, figure that out for yourself. But there's another truth that has emerged, I think, as I've looked at God's command of the sea, and that is God's power over the oceans, over the wind and the waves. And we've seen that both in the Old Testament, from some of those passages, like Psalms and Isaiah, and in the New Testament, where we've talked about Jesus commanding the wind and the waters, walking on the water. And so what appears maybe mysterious or terrifying to us isn't to God. It's part of his creation over which he rules, and it obeys his commands. And it may be that the way forward in our lives maybe seems like we're at sea. Maybe we feel adrift. Maybe things are chaotic, scary. We're just not sure what to do. Maybe at those times we can be reminded of that impetuous disciple by the name of Peter, who thought, you know what? I think it's better that I step out of the boat and risk sinking than not stepping out of the boat at all. And maybe in times in our life we need to trust the God, the one who is the ruler of the seas, and step out of the boat. Never heard of this gentleman before this past couple of weeks when I was doing reading and research for this talk about God and the seas. This is St. Brendan. St. Brendan was a 6th century Irish monk and traveler. It's claimed that St. Brendan claimed that he discovered a new land in the far west. And it's thought that he may have gone as far as Iceland, Greenland, maybe even North America, well ahead of the Vikings, who don't come along until the 10th century and end up Newfoundland. And, of course, Christopher Columbus, who sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Right, okay? I want to close with this prayer that is attributed to Brendan, and his title is St. Brendan the Navigator. And this will be our prayer to close today. Father, help us to journey beyond the familiar and into the unknown. Give us the faith to leave old ways and break fresh ground with you. Christ of the mysteries, we trust you to be stronger than each storm within us. We will trust in the darkness and know that our times, even now, are in your hands. Tune our spirits to the music of heaven and somehow make our obedience count for you. In Jesus' name we pray.